how the people are doing. So, this comparison. Here's the deal about the Pixel 9 Pro XL. I can tell you right now, without even actually looking side by side at the photographs from both of these, there are going to be certain instances where it's going to suffer. It won't make any sense as to why it's suffering, but it is going to suffer, without a doubt. That's just been the case with the Pixel. It's been a while since that's been the case, for a few generations now. I don't really know why, but that's just the way it is. Now, the X200 Pro, on the other hand, usually Vivo doesn't make uncanny or unexplained decisions as to why we have issues here, but this time they did. And I really want to find out exactly how the decision that they made with the main camera is going to affect the overall photography comparison and the photography performance against the previous generation, again, fairly capable flagship that we have over here. So let's jump in. Alright, let's start with the classics, the color profiles. As you can probably tell, Vivo has a lot of preset options that we have. So there is the vivid colors, there is a textured mode, and there's obviously the nice natural colors. Now, the way things work with Vivo is simple. If you don't want to tinker with the finer settings and you don't really want the granular control, you still have some good options. Now, the Pixel, on the other hand, you can, technically speaking, get these similar presets, or at least get your colors and your contrast and your exposure to look very similar to the presets that we have on the X200 Pro, because it does give you complete granular control. So does the X200 Pro, but I think the reason the X200 in terms of color profiles pulls ahead is because it gives you certain presets. Not everyone is going to be willing or even care enough to play around with the finer details and the settings, but when it comes to presets, it's easy to understand exactly which one you want. For me, it's going to be the nice natural colors, as you might have guessed. And I'm just going to keep the default color profile on the Pixel because in my experience, it works out more than well enough, at least for my taste, because I don't like oversaturated unnatural colors. The Pixel gives us very nice looking colors, and it also gives us a fairly nice dose of contrast. Now, to be completely fair, the Pixel also has a really obvious issue right here. It really doesn't like to handle warmth well. It'll completely remove it from most of the scenes. Like, if you have warm street light, it's gonna more or less turn white or very pale yellow. That's not gonna be particularly accurate or desirable, to be entirely honest, because warmth in the scene, if it's present, I'd like it to be there in its fullest glory. That's usually why I take warm photographs in certain situations, because the warmth gives character to the scene, and if that's removed, well then it kind of becomes sterile, so to speak. Now, when it comes to dynamic range, actually the Pixel will technically pull ahead because it does, as you might have expected. With the Smart HDR, it will produce a lot more detail in the shadows, whilst also doing a fairly good job of preserving the highlight. Highlight preservation is very similar across the board, but to be honest, not only is it completely removing all of that beautiful warmth from the sunset, it's also looking really flat, and that's not something I particularly like. Now, this is a personal preference, obviously, but I do think I prefer how the X200 looks, how it's maintaining a lot of the contrast in the scene, and personally, it does look nicer. Now, I understand some people with their pea-brains will think that I'm showing bias towards Vivo, but this is a personal preference. There's a difference. And now let's move on to the ultra-wide camera. So here's the deal. I think both phones look phenomenal with the ultra-wides for different reasons. First and foremost, more often than not, you will get slightly better contrast on the X200 Pro. It won't always be the case because the Pixel's contrast with the ultra-wide camera is generally very good. But the reason I feel the Pixel might pull ahead for a lot of people, including myself, is because it has such a beautiful wide field of view. The X200 Pro, I think that's been one of Vivo's biggest issues, is that their field of view with the ultra-wide camera is just not good enough. And well, I do hope they improve it in possibly the next generation, or maybe the Ultra that comes out soon. Hopefully that thing comes out for global. I mean, at this point it should be obvious, right? Even with certain backlit conditions and so on and so forth, neither of these phones is gonna struggle here. They have different styles, they have different approaches when it comes to HDR and color processing and so on and so forth. There are certain things that can be considered issues, but at the end of the day, a lot of it does depend on preference. Like, do you like the slightly higher contrast look of the X200, or do you prefer the slightly more processed look of the Pixel? And so on and so forth. But this shot in particular, I think it deserves a little bit more attention. Just take a look at that sky. I mean, it's way too good on the X200 Pro. All the details in the clouds. You can barely even see the clouds on the Pixel, which is very odd. Usually, Pixel's the one that's bringing out all the details and is boosting the clarity and the contrast, but that's not the case here. Now, when it comes to macro photography, I do think that the Pixel could do a little bit better. Initially, you might be thinking, well, we can get closer with the Pixel. It's again removing every ounce of warmth that was in the scene. You can probably tell, like, the X200 is realistic. A Pixel is very much not. Now at 3.7x, yes, the Pixel can get a little bit closer with this ultra-wide macro as opposed to the X200, but the X200 Pro does give us a 2x sensor crop on top of the telephoto macro, which it makes it easily one of the absolute best for macro photography out there. And now for the zoom test. So 2x sensor crop. I mentioned the main camera issue with the X200 Pro, right? So here's the deal. Vivo decided to downsize their sensor and basically gave us a smaller sensor as opposed to what we had with the X100 series. Whether the X100 Pro or the Ultra, both of them had 1-inch sensors. This time it's I think a 1 by 1.3 inch, which is a fair bit smaller. But my question is this, as opposed to the Pixel, does it actually make a difference? At least with the 2x sensor crop, I'd say not even close, because the Pixel's detail preservation is nowhere near as good as the X200 Pro. The X200 Pro is not perfect. There are phones out there like the Xiaomi 14 Ultra in the previous comparison, which did pull ahead as opposed to the X200 Pro, but at least compared to the Google, the X200 is doing a far better job. And now 3.7x. Now, this should be plenty obvious, right? The Pixel doesn't really have any optical zoom here, and it's not like its detail preservation is anything to write home about, so naturally, the X200 Pro pulls it. I think that was more than obvious. Now this is actually where things get very interesting. So we are taking a look at 5x now. And at 5x, the Pixel does have optical zoom. But we also know that the X200 Pro quite possibly has one of the highest quality telephoto cameras known to mankind. There's really nothing else quite like it on the market right now. At least not among the phones I've used. And I guess to no one's surprise, when we do crop into 500%, the X200 Pro is without a doubt pulling ahead. It's got way too good detail preservation for the Pixel to even keep up. Even though it has an optical zoom advantage, it doesn't really matter. And now for the good old-fashioned high resolution. So here's the deal. I like how the Pixel looks, without a doubt, but the X200 Pro looks really processed. There's a very good reason for that. So far, the X200 was using Zeiss natural colors, which is why the colors and the contrast, everything just looked pristine and beautiful. But with high-res, you don't get any of those options. And weirdly enough, when we crop in, the Google is still pulling ahead. So here's the deal. The Pixel 9 Pro's 2x sensor crop doesn't look as nice. But when it comes to high resolution, it is actually able to preserve a fair bit more detail as opposed to the X200 Pro. High res, in my opinion, has been one of those areas where the main camera really suffers. I'm pretty sure it's because the main camera is lower quality. But yeah, still not quite sure why the 2x was worse on the Pixel, but still, a win is a win in the high res at least. And now the ultra-wide camera is once again high resolution right here. And as you can tell, once again the Pixel is pulling ahead. It seems in high res, the detail preservation on the Pixel 9 Pro XL really skyrockets. And the X200 Pro can't really keep up as well. Obviously, I'm more than certain that might just change when we go to 3.7x. So here's the deal, here's the way we're going to do this. First, we have the 50 megapixel mode on the X200 versus the 50 megapixels, but we are using the 5x telephoto because it's pointless to compare 3.7x on both, because the Pixel is not going to be able to do that. And of course, bear in mind, when we crop in, it is a 500% crop on the Pixel. But because of the focal length difference, the X200 Pro is actually cropping into somewhere around 700%, which is a lot. Even for a 50 megapixel shot, it is still a lot. And despite that, also despite the fact that there isn't as good lighting, especially considering it's a high-res shot, it's not exactly ideal lighting conditions over here, we still get a lot of detail. There is a fundamental difference in the fact that the Pixel looks a lot more processed, so a lot more sharpening, and also a little bit more detail preservation because of that. But yeah, the X200 Pro is definitely keeping up. However, where things will more than likely get a little bit interesting, at least, no matter how things pan out, is in the simple fact that we can also take 200 megapixel shots on the X200 Pro. So bearing that in mind, let's crop all the way in, and it would appear that because the lighting isn't quite as ideal as you would normally take a high-res shot in, because this was fairly low light considering everything else, it's actually performing very similar to the 50 megapixel mode. So I guess for 200 megapixels, you do need a good amount of light, which you're just not having in this particular situation. That's definitely a good thing to know, because if you are gonna get the X200 Pro and you do want to use a 200 megapixel mode, which I don't know how many people want that, but still, if you do, well then, you should bear in mind that there needs to be a good amount of light. Doesn't need to be tremendous, but a good amount. Not as low as this one at least. Now when it comes to selfies, things are going to be a little bit more interesting, especially for the X200, because even though I do think for the most part in most selfies and selfie portraits, I did prefer the skin tones on the X200 Pro. I think it just looked a little too washed out on the Pixel, and just not quite as nicely saturated as I would prefer it to be, well, I still think the Pixel will pull ahead for the most part, because not only does it have much better dynamic range, it doesn't blow out highlights on my face for no goddamn reason, and it also has a much wider field of view, which I do appreciate a lot. The X200, I think the field of view is one of the two major problems that I have. That and, of course, the highlights. The highlights just unnaturally blow out so many times on the X200 Pro. It's very inconsistent in that regard. Sometimes it's going to give you a perfect selfie. Like, there will literally be no problems whatsoever, and then out of nowhere it's going to produce a selfie which has highlights blown out on your face, specifically on your bloody face, which makes no sense. Now, when it comes to rare portraits, well, I think this is where the Pixel is going to suffer quite a bit. Mainly starting off from the fact that when you try to take a main camera regular 1x portrait, you can do that on the X200 Pro, but you can't on the Pixel 9 Pro XL. Because for some reason, Google thought it was better to just start from 1.5x. Look, I don't mind a 35mm or a 1.5x cropped in portrait. Oftentimes it can give you good framing, but locked into that whenever you take a portrait is just not good. It's just not the way to go. Simple. Also, the overall edge detection on the Pixel is one of the worst. It is atrocious a lot of the times. Dynamic range isn't all that good, and to be entirely honest, it should be plenty obvious that the X200 Pro is the one which has much better portraits. Not just because it gives you all the options that you require. You can't even use the 5x telephoto zoom on the Pixel to take a portrait, just so you know. You're literally limited in digital crop starting from 1.5x to 3x, which is just... why? How is that logical? But there is another thing to consider. The Vivo will give you tremendous options when it comes to portrait mode. Like, you could tweak it all the way to high heaven and back to hell. Or maybe the other way around. Anyways, the point is that the Vivo's more than likely gonna give you much better portraits. Now, when it comes to night mode, things might be a little bit more different. Because, far as I can remember, the Pixel has always had really nice night mode. Night mode is good on both phones, but the fact is this: I've never really quite liked the way Vivo used to handle their night modes, until quite recently with the X200 Pro, because it seems they finally fixed it and it is very natural. It is even more natural as opposed to the Pixel 9 Pro XL, which is quite something. The Pixel has really nice night mode, not the best, not the most natural in the world, but it's very close. And the X200 actually goes a few steps further. It ensures that it maintains that nighttime contrast, it ensures that it maintains that nighttime look, and actually for the most part you will end up seeing better dynamic range and highlight preservation on the X200 Pro as opposed to the Pixel. Also, in certain cases at least, I have noticed that the X200 can preserve the warmth just like in daylight images, as opposed to the Pixel 9 Pro, which will wash it out a little bit. So I guess for the most part night mode can be very good on both, but I do believe that the X200 pulls ahead simply because it just gives you slightly better highlight preservation, and just a dynamic range with night mode, it works out far better than it does with the Google. But of course, we also need to check out the zoom at night, especially starting with that 2x. Now, as you might remember, the Pixel wasn't particularly good with the 2x sensor crop during the daytime shots for some reason, because its main camera high res was a lot better as opposed to the X200, but regardless, at night at least, I'd say that the X200 can't really keep up. I'm pretty sure the processing can't exactly keep up with the lower lighting conditions, because as you can probably tell, it's very similar. Neither of them look particularly good. There's a lot of artifacting, a lot of sharpening, and it doesn't really look all that appealing on either, but it is very similar. So for the sake of the comparison, it's pretty much a tie. Now when it comes to 5x, the Pixel does still have the optical zoom advantage, but of course at night, will it actually be able to perform as well as it did? I guess, yeah, to a fair extent. There is more processing, and I'm definitely seeing more artifacting and sharpening on the X200 Pro as opposed to the Pixel, which is basically doing none of that. Usually the Pixel has a tendency to sharpen a lot, doesn't it? But this time, not quite, apparently. But yeah, I'd say that it's like two sides of a coin. The Pixel will give you a more natural looking shot at the end of the day, even though we are cropping to 500%, 700% on the X200 Pro, but I'd say more or less similar in quality. The Pixel will have less detail, less processing, and the exact opposite on the X200. So that brings us to the end of this comparison. I'm gonna keep this nice and short. The Pixel has a lot of problems, whether it's with the portraits, the highlight preservation, the detail preservation, except for high res for some reason. Well, it's got issues, obviously, and I'm really hoping that Pixel will update all of these problems, especially the portrait mode. Just fix that damn thing. It's about time. Portrait mode depends more on software than almost anything else, and software is supposed to be Google's department, so they need to handle the situation. It's been way too long that portrait modes have sucked balls on the pixels. It's stupid at this point. Anyways, with the X200 Pro on the other hand, yes, there are problems. Let's just say, especially with high res. That's where I'm seeing it suffer the most with the main camera and even the ultrawide camera against the pixel. So yeah, there's obvious concerns, but I feel like high res does fall into a bit of a niche, which maybe not everyone's going to be interested in using all of the time, because every other situation, let's say regular shots or portrait mode or regular night mode shots, those did perform slightly better in each of the categories. So overall, I think the X200 Pro is a slightly better camera, at least for my personal uses. It is definitely a better camera as opposed to the Pixel, mainly because I really do not like the warmth being taken out of my scene. That's my biggest problem, as opposed to everything else that the X200 Pro suffers from. Having proper warmth and accurate colors and that beautiful Zeiss Central color profile that we have, it works out for me. So my personal pick would be the X200 Pro. If you feel that the Pixel is the winner here, definitely let me know why, because I'm interested in knowing. That's all. Well, with that said, I hope you guys enjoyed, found this helpful, and I'll be seeing you guys soon around with more. Cheers.